Stalin, section. The Great Patriotic War and Khrushchev's Inventions. Starting with Stalingrad and the defeat inflicted on the Third Reich, the latter with a might that had seemed unbeatable, Stalin acquired enormous prestige around the world. And not by chance does Khrushchev give particular attention to this matter. He describes in catastrophic terms the lack of military preparedness by the Soviet Union, whose army in some cases lacked the most basic armaments. Arguing against this is the overview that emerges from a study that appears to come from those connected to the Bundeswehr and makes ample use of their military archives. In it, they speak of the, quote, numerical superiority of the Red Army in armored cars, planes, and artillery pieces. Further, quote, the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union had reached such dimensions that they could supply the Soviet armed forces with an almost unimaginable amount of weaponry. End quote. It rises at an ever-increasing rate as Operation Barbarossa approached. One stat is particularly eloquent. While in 1940 the Soviet Union produces 358 advanced armored cars, measurably superior to those available to other armed forces, in the first half of the following year, 1,503 are produced. For their part, the documents from the Russian archives demonstrate that, at least during the 2 years before the Third Reich's aggression, Stalin was literally obsessed with the problem of the, quote, quantitative increase and the, quote, qualitative improvement of the entire military apparatus, end quote. Some data speaks for itself. While in the first 5-year plan, the defense budget reached 5.4% of total state spending, in 1941, the military budget increased to 43.4% of spending. Quote, in September of 1939, by order of Stalin, the Politburo made the decision to construct in the year of 1941 9 new factories for the production of planes. By the time of the Nazi invasion, Soviet industry had produced 2,700 modern planes and 4,300 armored cars. End quote. Judging by this data, we can say that the USSR arrived anything but unprepared for the tragic confrontation. A decade earlier, an American historian dealt a substantial blow to the myth of the despair and abandonment of responsibilities by the Soviet leader soon after the start of the Nazi invasion. Quote, for, however shocked he was, on the day of the attack, Stalin had an 11-hour meeting with leaders of the party, government, and military, and did the same the following day. End quote. But now we have at our disposal the registry of those that visited Stalin in the Kremlin, discovered at the beginning of the 1990s. It appears that, in the hours immediately following the military aggression, the Soviet leader was immersed in a series of uninterrupted meetings and initiatives to organize the resistance. They are days and nights characterized as, quote, strenuous, but organized. In any case, quote, the entire episode, narrated by Khrushchev, is a complete invention. This story is false. End quote. In reality, from the start of Operation Barbarossa, Stalin not only makes challenging decisions, giving the order for the relocation of residents and industrial installations from the frontline areas, but, quote, he controls everything in a meticulous way, from the size and shape of the bayonets to the authors and titles of the articles in Pravda. End quote. There is no sign of panic or hysteria. Dimitrov offers the following account in a diary entry. Quote, at 7 in the morning, they urgently called me to the Kremlin. Germany has attacked the USSR. The war has started. It's surprisingly calm, with resolve and confidence in Stalin and all the others. End quote. More impressive yet is the clarity of ideas. It's not only a matter of carrying out, quote, the general mobilization of our forces, end quote. It's necessary as well to define the political situation. Yes, quote, only communists can defeat the fascists, end quote, and put an end to the apparently irresistible rise of the Third Reich. But it's necessary not to lose sight of the real nature of the conflict. Quote, the Communist parties develop locally a movement in defense of the USSR, not putting forward the question of the socialist revolution. The Soviet people fight a patriotic war against fascist Germany. The question is the defeat of fascism, which enslaved a series of nations and tries to enslave other nations as well. End quote. The political strategy that had presided over the Great Patriotic War is well defined. Already some years earlier, Stalin had stressed that the expansionism carried out by the Third Reich, quote, is in pursuit of the enslavement and submission of other nations, end quote. These nations respond with just wars of resistance and national liberation. To those that academically counterpose patriotism and internationalism, the Communist International had responded once again before Hitler's aggression, as is shown in the entry in Dimitrov's diary from May 12, 1941, that, beginning of long quote, it is necessary to develop a line of thought that combines wise nationalism, properly understood, with proletarian internationalism. Proletarian internationalism should be based on the nationalism of individual countries. Between that, properly understood nationalism, and proletarian internationalism, there can be no contradiction. Nationless cosmopolitanism, which denies national sentiment and the idea of the nation, doesn't have anything in common with proletarian internationalism. End of quote. Far from being an improvised and desperate reaction to the situation created by the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the strategy of the Great Patriotic War expresses a theoretical orientation of a general character maturing for some time. Internationalism and the international cause of the emancipation of nations led directly to the wave of wars of national liberation, made necessary by Hitler's intention to seize and radicalize the colonial tradition, by first subjecting and enslaving the supposedly inferior races of Eastern Europe. These are the recurring themes in the speeches and statements delivered by Stalin during the war. They constituted, quote, important cornerstones in the clarification of Soviet military strategy and its political objectives, and played an important role at the hour of re-strengthening popular morale, end quote. They took on international importance as well, as Goebbels observed to his own annoyance. Stalin's radio speech on July 3, 1941, quote, earned enormous admiration in England and the United States. End quote, and end of section.